My name is Annette, and I'm fairly new with the ministry, so maybe not everyone have seen me yet. And I have Amy with me over here, and we're going to continue on the TG6 by looking at some scenarios. Actually, you'll be looking at some scenarios, right? Because this is supposed to be the workshop. But before we start, we just have a couple of background slides just to clarify some of the most common questions that we are still getting on TG6, and also to get the one of you that haven't done a water use determination for up to speed so that you can actually do the scenarios. So we'll focus mainly on drinking water exemption here, because that is, it's probably the one that most interesting in getting an exemption from, and it's also maybe the one that is a little bit more complicated. So drinking water exemptions can really follow two different streams. You can exempt a site directly through TG6, or you can get a director's determination that drinking water does not apply. So if you have a site that you can exempt directly through TG6, following the criteria that are given there for how to exempt a site from drinking water use, you have site-specific data to use in every single one of your arguments. Well, you can go directly through TG6, present your arguments in your P6 submission, and you're good to go. We would like, this does not require any input whatsoever from the ministry. However, we would like you to include your arguments and your background data in your summary of site condition. And this is fairly new, and I'll just get back to it here on the next slide, why it is that we have this in there. So sites that cannot be exempted through TG6. Maybe you don't have site-specific data, or maybe you have problem exempting your shallow aquifer because it's slightly bigger than the 2 meters that are now the new criteria. But you still feel that, drinking water should really not apply on my site. You can apply for a director's determination. So here you apply with the ministry, and we have put up a guideline with our multiple lines of evidence approach. And I'll get back to that in a couple of slides too, explaining that. So here, you apply with the ministry for water use determination, and we will, grant it or not. This also means that if you have a site that is exempted through TG6, some people have wanted us to give, the stamp on that, yes, you did it correctly, right? Your site is exempt. We don't do that. Right? If you exempt through TG6, we do not get involved in this. We only get involved with sites that are not exempted through TG6. So back to this summary of site condition. I mean, we have from the beginning of this new TG6, which came out in 2010, I think? 2011. We've been mapping sites that we have exempted, just sort of for, it helps us in our daily work, and it also is a great service for you guys, right? When many of you have found out, you can call in and ask us, has there been any exemption in this area? And if so, can you send me the report so we can see what arguments they used? And that's been a great tool, but so far we also always had to say, but just be aware, just because we have not exempted any sites does not mean that there hasn't been any drinking water exemption in this area, because they can have gone directly through the roster and we have no idea. So we would like to add that data to our map here, so that, first of all, when you call, we could also tell you, okay, there actually has been a lot of exemption in this area, but also for future use, we could actually go in and say, okay, we have so many exemptions on this area, you have enough data to maybe go out and exempt an entire area so that you don't have to go through the water use determination for certain areas. So this is, see a lot of our determinations here, the yellow ones from Falls Creek, where we have made exemptions. We got one so far here, where it's been exempted directly through TG6, and we hope to build on that map. And the only way we can do that is that, we're going to just quickly read through the summary of site condition to make sure that this why was this site actually exempted? So to do that, we need you to provide, your data and your arguments, and I think it's done in that section that's called hydrogeology and stratigraphy. Yeah. So that would be a great help. And this is new, and we are sort of in a transition period, right? So far we have had to go back to some of you and ask for, can you just clarify or add where in your DSI did you present this so we can quickly check it? We also had a couple of sites where clearly there's been some misinterpretation of TG6, and the water use determination could not be gone or not have been done directly through TG6, but probably should have gone through us. But now everyone knows, so hopefully we don't have those issues anymore. Why does that not come out? Well, just here's the flow chart. This is how to do it. It's mainly so you have it in your printout here for when you're actually doing the exemptions. So like Lavinia said, we have new flow charts, and it has really improved the understanding of how the exemption process works. And then for our multiple line of evidence approach, how we determine if a site qualifies for a director's determination of water use. Used to be called the weight of evidence, but apparently some risk assessors had already taken that term and made it theirs, so we had to come up with a new word. So this is the multiple lines of evidence approach, it's called now, but it's really exactly the same. So to start the process, you need to have no current drinking water use, and you have to have future drinking water use supplies. So in other words, again, if your site has qualified for TG6 and you can show you don't have future drinking water use, you don't go through this process. So we set up some criteria here that the ministry will at least consider. It's not, you're welcome to come forward with other arguments if you can come up with some, but this is definitely what the ministry will consider. So we have for water quality, long historical industrial use with multiple landowners, multiple sources, and widespread contamination. And this does not mean that if you have a single industrial landowner that's been operating on the same site for 100 years that he can then get a drinking water exemption. These are for sites where you cannot determine who is responsible for this contamination. And it's typically, it's an argument that's been used for the Falls Creek exemptions. So close to a marine receiving environment where you have the groundwater flowing directly to the marine and you are not affecting any of your neighboring properties. You can use that as an argument. It's not enough to just say you're close to the marine. We actually would like to see some data to prove it, right? Like elevated TDS, elevated sodium chloride, tidal influence, whatever you can come up with. And being located next to a fresh water lake that's used for drinking water is not a marine environment. We'd actually had that in one application. Poor quality of fill, where you know that the quality of the fill is poor and that it's resulting in contamination of the groundwater. That's a good argument. You can only use it, though, if that aquifer is not connected directly to a valuable drinking water aquifer below it. So you need to have either that natural confining barrier or no aquifer below. So aquifer productivity, if you can show that yield of the 1.3 liters per minute is not sustainable, like maybe your shallow aquifer is of limited size, and if you pump for it for 10 years, you can no longer get the 1.3, that's a really fine argument to put forward. To say that you're building a high-rise on this site and you're going to need way more than 1.3 liter per minute is not an argument. I mean, the 1.3, that is the number that we use for looking at aquifer yield. And finally, some different groundwater demands criteria. Municipal water supply in place that does not rely on groundwater. Aquifer not classified as high demand, and it's not located in an area of limited water resources, and that the groundwater is not restricted for drinking water use under a local government water management plan. And there are sort of supporting arguments. If you only meet one of these arguments, you're probably not going to get a drinking water exemption. I mean, it is multiple lines of evidence, and it is recommended to meet several of the criteria to get the exemption. And we always encourage you to call us first. We can very quickly often tell you on the phone or on an email that you're not going to qualify for drinking water exemption. You don't even need to apply. Or if, you stand a pretty good chance, maybe you should put in an application. So the applications for drinking water use exemption, it still has to go through all the criteria in TG6. And then on top of that, we can have these additional criteria. So now the scenarios, we have created 6 different scenarios, which are going to cover sort of most of the different sites that we've seen, and they all been inspired by applications or emails from you guys. So if you see something familiar, you've been picked out. So each scenario has sort of a short description, and it has a little cross-section to visualize it that you can use to scribble on. And I would just like you to sort of think of these 5 questions here. Does drinking water apply at all? Does this application, would it have to go through the ministry? And if so, what do you need to present? And if it does not, well, if it can go through directly through your roster, what do you need to include in your summary of site condition? And what about the information? Would you have like to see more or less data? Okay, we're going to stop now, and Amy and I will just quickly go through the different scenarios. And it's okay, you're not done. You can look at them tonight.
Can I just ask you a general question?
Yeah.
Just a general question. So in Lavinia's presentation, you call this thing a natural confining barrier, and that's 3 words. But we used to call this an aquifer, and that's 1 word. Why don't we call it an aquifer?
We have if you have higher than 10 to the minus 6, you're an aquifer. Right? Then we have sort of the one in between, right? And then we have the lower than 10 to the minus 7 was definitely, you can call it an aquitard or a confining barrier. But it was also to cover that sort of in between. I think it's
for that 10 to the minus 6, 10 to the minus 7 grade.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, so I see again, it doesn't come up but we will just quickly go through it here anyway. So the first one is an example that we have seen several times. So we have no drinking water wells within 500 meters of the site. We have a sand unit with some peat in it, and they actually show you have more than 30% organic matter in that sand, or in the peat, and it's 4 meters thick. And then we have silt until the end of the investigation, which was at 10 meters below ground. Groundwater table is found at 1 meter. We have some hydraulic testing here, which clearly does not show up, but you have it in your printout. There's been a search in the BC Water Resource Atlas, which shows that you have the Vancouver Quarter Sands Aquifer below. It's characterized by moderate productivity, moderate vulnerability, and it's a non-drinking water use. There's a large industrial operation on the site with a long history of use. There's an extensive contamination in the silt and the sand unit, and it has not been delineated to drinking water standards yet. So what is your feeling? Does drinking water apply? Yeah, drinking water applies.
No, I'm going to hire a consultant that says because it's got 30% peat in it, it's musky.
That's yeah. I'll go through it here. I will start by saying what we've seen in many of these applications as an error is that you have not included data on this quarter sands aquifer. The investigations has stopped at that 10 meter below ground. You have shown the hydraulic conductivity of that silt unit is lower than 10 to the minus 6. You're not in an aquifer. Drinking water use does not apply. And then the site would have been exempted. but that's not the case. We have the quarter sands aquifer below. Yes, it does say non-drinking water in the BC Water Resource Atlas. It's a word we have been trying to change so it's not so confusing. That does not mean that it's not a viable aquifer. It means it's not currently used for drinking water. So the drinking water use evaluation says you start with your lowest, deepest aquifer. This is the quarter sands aquifer. Drinking water use applies to this aquifer. Go to the next unit, your silt unit. Well, we have a hydraulic conductivity that is lower than 10 to the minus 6, so we know we're not in an aquifer. But however, is it a confining unit? There we have more than 6 tests with slug tests to show the hydraulic conductivity, so we're allowed to use the 90th percentile of the K, which gives us, I had that written down somewhere, oops, the 5.4 times 10 to the minus 7. Then we can calculate an equivalent thickness, which means we have to show 27 meters of clean silt unit to exempt, or for this unit to qualify as a confining barrier. We don't have data to prove that. There's also extensive contamination, and most likely you will not be able to prove that. So drinking water use will apply to this unit. It's not a natural confining barrier, and even though it's not an aquifer. Then you have your sand with peat on top. Yes, we do have more than 30% organic content, which is the cutoff criteria to actually exempt an aquifer based on organic content. However, it is directly connected because we don't have a natural confining barrier underneath it, so it's connected to the quarter sands aquifer, so you cannot exempt that shallow aquifer based on that argument. Having your long history of industrial use, well, it's a single industrial owner that has created this contamination. It is not a viable argument. So drinking water use applies to this site with the argument listed there, as I just mentioned. You cannot exempt it through TG6. If you apply for a director's determination, it would also be turned down, so there's not even any need to apply. And we would be able to tell you that, sending us an email or giving us a phone call beforehand. So the next scenario, the bedrock. Right, we have no drinking water wells again. We have a sand and gravel fill that's less than 1 meter thick. We have a silt unit that's between 1 to 5 meter thick. We have bedrock. We have groundwater contamination that exceeds into the silt and also in several of the bedrock wells. And again, here there's supposed to be some slug test showing your measured on site for hydraulic conductivity. So does drinking water use apply to this site? No. Drinking water use does not apply. So again, we start with the lowest aquifer. The bedrock, we have contamination all the way to the bedrock, so we actually will need to do an investigation of the bedrock. If that had not been the case, you would not need to do future investigations on this bedrock aquifer. But here we do have contamination, so we need to investigate what the hydraulic conductivity is of this bedrock aquifer. Right, we have more than 6 tests, so we're allowed to use the geometric mean, 6.7 times 10 to the minus 7. It's less than 10 to the minus 6, so it's not an aquifer. Drinking water use does not apply. Notice here the max value, which is what you have to default to if you don't have more than 6 values measured, is higher than 10 to the minus 6, so then you would actually not have been able to exempt this drinking water aquifer or bedrock aquifer. The silt, here we have less than 6 measurements. We use the max K value. It shows that it's less than 10 to the minus 6. So it's not an aquifer. Drinking water use does not apply. If there had been a little shallow aquifer up in the fill, it would have been less than 2 meters thick, so drinking water use does not apply. So overall, for the site, drinking water use does not apply. We do not need to see this application. It can be exempted directly through TG6. So you include the information with your water well search, your borehole logs, your site-specific slug test, and your arguments for that drinking water use does not apply, and include that information in your summary of site conditions so that we can put it on our map. And then it's your turn.
Okay.
So I have, down there, okay. Okay, thank you. So I have a False Creek example. And so yeah, you have no current use. There's municipal water supply, long history, multiple owners, multiple sources, widespread contamination. There's an area-wide determination for this area. No aquifer identified, according to the Water Resource Atlas. A continuous bedrock geology. You have those maps from the Geological Survey of Canada. Got this fill layer. You have a high K. You've got your groundwater table, it's 2 meters thick. Then you've got the silt layer. So, according to just a TG6 evaluation here, it's 2 to 3 meters thick. So that's not less than 2 meters. So just going through TG6 on its own, that would probably qualify as an aquifer. And then it's underlain by bedrock. But you don't actually have data for that bedrock. So does drinking water apply? Let me see if my other little slides came up here. So there we've got our area-wide determination for the fill. You can use that in your arguments, and you're able to exempt that portion of the aquifer because you've got your poor quality fill, multiple sources, multiple landowners. Oops. So DW doesn't apply, but it definitely needs to come into the ministry, and there's several reasons why. If we go back one, we'll see that we have this silt layer as well, but it was present with seashells, so you can make that marine argument as well. You also may be able to include some elevated sodium and chloride. You're also using data from a nearby site, so that's the other reason why it needs to come into the ministry too. But you're able to exempt that bedrock because the K is so low. So we need to see quite a bit of information, as you can see. So we'll be asking for you to supply all that information in addition to your statement. So it's not just enough to say, there's a saltwater influence, we think, or that's what I believe. Show us the sodium and the chloride data. Show us the borehole logs to show the seashells. Present your area-wide determination for the soils for the upper layer. Show us your pump test data. Show the pump test data for the neighboring site as well for the bedrock. Reference the GSC map that you're using as well for the continuity of that bedrock. And if you're able to provide all that information, you don't really need to give us anything else, I don't believe. I think that's sufficient. And just indicate on your summary of site conditions that it's come through us already, and that's where that TG6 applicability holds true. Marine environment. We've had a few that we've seen like this too. So again, no drinking water wells within 500 meters. The water for the city is sourced from surface several kilometers away. The regional district also confirms they don't have any intentions of developing groundwater in the area. Long history, multiple sources of contamination, and widespread contamination. It's adjacent to the marine environment. But your TDS is less than 4,000, so you can't, that's quality issue with TG6. Can you exempt through TG6 based on that? But your groundwater flows towards the ocean. So you have bedrock below as well, but the contamination doesn't go that deep. So what are your thoughts? Does drinking water apply? Yeah. So saltwater wedges are pretty common. We see them fairly frequently. they might only affect a portion of the aquifer. And if that unaffected portion is less than 2 meters thick, or it's present only seasonally, contained with organic soils, then sure, drinking water doesn't apply, and you can go directly through TG6, but that isn't the instance here. It's obvious that it's got the conductivity, it's greater than 2 meters, it's less than 4,000 milligrams per liter. But it is on industrial land with multiple sources, and this helped us develop as well as multiple lines of evidence for what we're looking for. But the other important portion here to consider is that the bedrock is uncontaminated as well. So you don't need to go down and investigate the bedrock if you're not contaminated that deep down there. So one other important thing to remember for this site, though, is that because it is close to the water, AW will still apply as well. So just through TG6 on its own, you can't include these drinking water exemptions, even if it is specific to industrial lands located next to the marine foreshore. And it's because there are many aquifers located next to the marine foreshore, and they can represent valuable sources of drinking water for their yield. So the application would still need to come into the MoE for these sites that border the marine foreshore, if that's the type of data you have. But you need to be able to prove to us all the data in the multiple lines of evidence. So I'd want to see all your TDS values, especially those that are close to 4,000. Even if they don't exceed 4,000, it helps support your arguments that there's a saline wedge that exists. Also, if you have any types of reports where someone's been doing research in that area, where they can document this saline wedge, or a statement from your hydrogeologist regarding the presence of the saline wedge and whether, in their professional opinion, they believe if there's the presence of a freshwater aquifer below. These are the types of information and supporting data that we want to see when your application comes into the ministry. So just some extra things to sort of think, though. If you do have contamination down to the bedrock and your K is less than 1 times 10 to the minus 6, then the bedrock doesn't qualify as an aquifer. However, if your K is greater than 10 to the minus 6, then there's going to need to be further arguments presented to the ministry. So it gets complicated once you have contamination down to that bedrock. However, if your saturated thickness is less than 2 meters and you've got enough arguments that it qualifies through TG6 on its own, and there's no ministry application that would need to come into us in this instance. But it is important to note, if you are going through the roster and that was your situation, that you noted in the SOSC that the contamination does not extend down to the bedrock, and it's been delineated. So the confining unit. So again, no drinking water use within 500 meters. The K measurements are in the confining unit. We have more than 5 of those measurements. So which of these values do we accept when it's the confining unit? It's the 90th percentile. If you only had 1 measurement, we want the maximum. If you only have 4 measurements, we want the maximum. It's once you've exceeded 5 measurements in the confining unit, you can use the 90th percentile. And if it's actually, yep. 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. So, does drinking water apply in this instance? We have no groundwater data for the confining unit, but we do have some soil chemistry data in that, we have no below the confining data, and we have soil chemistry data, though, so we know where the contamination lies. So obviously we have a shallow perched aquifer, and it's less than 1 meter thick. Is it adequately protected, that fill layer, with that clay unit? So what we're looking at in this instance is we're looking at the alternative equivalent thickness calculation. So DW doesn't apply to the shallow aquifer, but it still applies to the deeper aquifer and the bottom 15 meters of the aquitard or confining layer unit, you're using the equivalent thickness here, so it's not just the bottom 5 meters. You're using your 90th percentile for your hydraulic conductivity. We need to know in the summary of site conditions what the K values are, and we need to know a bit about that contamination into that confining unit. In other cases, it isn't critical for us to know your contamination when you're going through your TG6 arguments, but in this instance, we need to see them because you're using your confining unit. You have a bit of contamination in that top layer as well, so we need to know where that contamination ends, where it's clean, that you have that equivalent thickness there. And again, since we have more than 5 measurements in the confining unit, then we'll accept the 90th percentile. So if the bottom 2 meters of the aquitard has a higher K, can it still be an AP submission? Like, does it qualify through the appendix? It doesn't meet the equivalent thickness of 25 meters if you're just looking at those bottom 2 meters, but they have the 15 meters above are still considered clean. So in this instance, it could still be an AP submission as long as they can show that that contamination doesn't extend deeper than that, the 2 meters. However, if you were to take any type of your K data from an adjacent site, you don't have any on-site data, then that application definitely needs to still come into the ministry. And I'll very quickly go through this last one because I know everybody's getting hungry and their tummies are grumbling. So I was purposely vague on this one. Sometimes that's the type of information that we receive when we get our queries as well, and we're trying to do the best judgment that we have for based on your site information. But if you're not currently using it for IW and LW, the source site isn't agricultural, but you have a neighbor that is agricultural and they have a well and they're using it for drinking water, and it's going to be for agricultural purposes next year. So what standards would apply in this instance? So you would have drinking water apply on the site because you've got a drinking water use on site, or not on site, but within 500 meters. So you have a current use, and there's no point in putting it through to us because one of the qualifications for the multiple lines of evidence is that as a prerequisite, you can't be having a current use currently. But what standard's going to apply at the boundary of the site as well? So IW and LW wouldn't apply to the actual investigated property because you don't have an agricultural use there, but IW and LW still applies to the neighbor. So the application wouldn't come into us, but you should indicate in your summary of site conditions that you do meet IW and LW at that furthest down gradient well closest to the property boundary. There's a few metals and pesticides that are more stringent for IW and LW standard than for the DW standard. There's not a whole lot of contaminants where we see that. And manganese and iron, keep in mind, may be exempt based on the latest Stage 8 amendments as well. So to conclude, so that everyone can get something to eat, there's probably a lot of information that we presented to you all at once. So, but we've given you these scenarios to work through, and I hope that it was informative. But if you still find that you have a problem, if you're not sure if you should be using the multiple lines of evidence, if you can your site automatically qualifies through TG6, or you have other questions, if you have a problem, if no one else can help, you can call the A-team. That's us.